Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 19th of September, 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to be joined by David Scott, bringing us northern exposure from north of the border, and also Mark Anderson reporting from the United States.
David, let's get straight on. Of course, the only thing that's happening in the UK today is the funeral of the Queen.
Yes, first state funeral since Churchill. The coffin was carried out by the guards. The men from the Royal Navy pulled the gun carriage down the road, and the mass pipes and drums played Mist-Covered Mountains, and it was a moment to remember, and that the country can certainly carry off these events in the way that few can. And the ceremony continues, and it will culminate in a very simple Christian funeral service later today.
Okay, but over the weekend then, there were lots of people wanting to go and see.
Yes, I felt I should comment on this because I think this is actually quite a significant moment. So here we see The Guardian reporting the phenomenon of the queue, as it's become known, has attracted fascination, confusion, and all around Britain and across the world. Who would be willing to wait for hours, for as long as 24 hours outdoors, braving the elements along the Thames for a few seconds alongside the Queen's coffin, and why? They had this tea in the cold and visit from the King, the people waiting all night to see the Queen. Now, the point I want to make here is that all of the leftist organs, the Independent and various leftist commentators, are going mental about this. And it struck me as somewhat surprising, and I was thinking about why this is. And I put it to you that I think the answer is that they have a philosophy that is all about grievance, it's all about whining, it's all about constant angst, and it's also all about control. And here what we see in the part of the British people is a spontaneous, they won't like that, decision to proceed with dignity. And they don't like that either. Quiet dignity, I think, they find confusing and alarming. So I think this is another example of the British people's reaction to the Queen's passing being quite a significant moment for them.
David, I think that's a very interesting point. For me, over the weekend, I was trying to pick up the feeling of people around me, and something that I felt, maybe it was just me, but it was like people were trying to grab hold of something that was, bringing them together, but also it was some calm. And I know this might be considered a strange event to label as calm, but it was almost like people were grabbing hold of something, because of course they live in a world of increasingly orchestrated chaos and turmoil.
Exactly so. It's a culture. What we're seeing here is a culture of dignity and calm reasserting itself over the culture of victimhood and collapse and essentially panic that we've been told repeatedly for, well, certainly the last 2.5 years, and really for several decades, that we're meant to be living in constantly.
Yeah. Well, I picked up on this tremendous picture from the Times with the headline, "Charles gives thanks." The King says he's deeply touched by public support. They had this tremendous picture. Now, what was interesting about the picture is it's the Buckingham Palace 1844 room, and of course there's the lovely Liz Truss. I looked at them and I looked at the colours. Well, obviously we might expect sombre colours, but it was something to do with Liz Truss. And it's a stance, awkward, we might say it's awkward. And then I thought to myself, when you see, a black bird strutting around on the ground, and it's, I don't know, very strange posture, very uncomfortable.
It reminds me of Theresa May in many ways. But my thoughts about that room, Brian, are that have they chosen that room because the main colours are blue and yellow?
Well, possibly. That's a very good point. But I'm going to thank unusually Vogue for coming up with some information I didn't know, because Vogue said that this is called the 1844 room. because the year 1844, that's when the space received Russian Tsar Nicholas I, a guest so grand that his portrait once hung on its walls. So presumably we don't want anything Russian in the 1844 room, although it was apparently created for that very purpose.
Well, indeed. Indeed. Well, look, let's move on. And well, after this, immediately after the funeral ends, Theresa May will, sorry, Freudian slip there, Liz Truss will be heading onto a flight over to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. So I just wanted to sort of give people a flavour of what the most recent prime ministers of the UK have been saying at the United Nations General Assembly. So let's have a look at David Cameron. We're back in 2014 when in his speech to the UNGA, he said basically, and I'm paraphrasing, we've got to censor the internet. Theresa May then in 2018, she said counter disinformation globally with the rapid response, counter disinformation globally with the rapid response mechanism. And that, of course, is the notion that she sold to the G7 in June of that year, that there would be a common narrative across all the G7 countries for just about every policy area going. Then in 2019, of course, Theresa May was gone. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and his speech was all about those damned anti-vaxxers. At a time before COVID and before vaccine activity, anti-vaccine activity was really a thing. I mean, there were plenty of people campaigning, but it wasn't sort of at the forefront of the minds of politicians or the media at the time. So it was very strange that he brought that particular issue up 6 months before the COVID lockdowns and so on. Well, what's Liz Truss going to be bringing to the United Nations General Assembly? Well, it's going to be damn Putin and Xi. And this is very much the message. And in fact, an attempt now from Biden at least to encourage Xi to separate himself from Putin and sort of isolate Russia, but that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, this is very much the message that Liz Truss is going to be taking to the United Nations General Assembly. So, David, have you got any thoughts on that briefly?
Well, it's just striking how much lies our prime ministers have told when they've went to the UN General Assembly, when you see it with a little bit of historical perspective, and more on that later in the news.
But sticking with globalist institutions and globalist messages, then we head to Scotland. And, well, what's Nippy been up to?
Nippy's been on a job interview with the Rockefeller Foundation. So she's went along to a gathering with essentially the B team, all the people who won't be invited to the UN General Assembly, including Hillary Clinton, no less. Because apparently we are overdue for equity. Equity, we're told, is not just for women, but for democracy, for climate and for effective decision-making. We're overdue for equity. Are you inspired, gentlemen? So this has all been organised by the Rockefeller Foundation, who have convened a group of distinguished, by the way, women to discuss these matters. And we have a little clip, if you can stand it, of Nicola having a few words.
A long way to go towards gender equity, but the progress we have made is fragile. And if we don't safeguard it, nurture it and continue to build upon it, there is a real danger, in my view, in the years to come that it could go backwards. I'm Nicola Sturgeon, I'm the First Minister of Scotland. I think if more women are in leadership positions, that acts as a catalyst for change elsewhere. There's a wealth of evidence that whether we look at governments or the boards of companies or other organisations, if there is greater gender equity in the representation on these bodies, then decision making is more inclusive and better. If you look at climate change, women disproportionately are on the front line in climate change, particularly in the Global South. Women have child caring responsibilities, disproportionately have the responsibility to get food for their families, work in agriculture, and these are the women that are impacted by climate change right now. Equally, women will be on the front line of implementing the solutions to climate change. So if we can better involve women in those decisions, then the outcomes are going to be better represent what is needed and be more sustainable as a result. Other thing I would say though is it's not enough in and of itself to have women in positions of leadership. I think there is much more to be done to support women in those positions and to continue to tackle and challenge some of the barriers that women, even at the highest levels of decision making, still face. Women have been fighting these battles for generations. We have made progress, but sometimes it feels as if we take one step forward and two steps back. So we need to keep powering on to achieve equity, because we are most definitely overdue for equity.
I'm confused, David. How does that work with the trans agenda?
Oh, we'll come to that. Right, so we need equity. Okay, equity is key. And I would point out that at no time have I or the UK column ever accused Nicola Sturgeon of taking one step forward. We've never said that. But anyway, she thinks that that was perhaps something that might have happened. So apart from photo shooting, this has been pretty light on substance. So we see her here having another photograph taken with Hildy, and I have to say, Nicola, beige isn't your colour. Some of the other women, this African lady standing next to her has absolutely won the war of the fashion. It's fantastic. Nicola, not so much, but never mind. So this has all been done to launch a very light paper with very little information called Global Leaders Call for Urgent Action on Gender Equity. And they've got this quite shouty lady on the front. Now, this shouty lady is actually a Muslim lady in Kashmir protesting against Indian control of Kashmir. So this protest has nothing to do with gender issues, it's to do with geopolitics. So when there's a lie on the cover, you're thinking, well, this is quite strange. We've got a quote from Hilary. We live in a watershed moment, she says. Seldom has the world more urgently needed gender equality, and it's up to us to demand it. So this whole idea of demanding, constant whining and complaining about the system, this is part of kind of cultural Marxism. This is what Hilary comes from, and we've got more of this to come.
David, if
so
I could
to say, there's sorry, Brian.
David, just very quickly, I noticed that Hillary Clinton says gender equality, whereas the start was gender equity. And subtle differences are often important. So what's your take on the change of language?
Well spotted, Brian. Yes, equity and equality are not the same at all. And we'll come to exactly the difference, but notice Nicola says equity because Nicola's right on. The Hillary's probably forgotten a line. She's talking about a line from 10 years ago. We have here a little piece which is essentially expanding on what Nicola was talking about, supporting women's leadership amidst pushback. I wonder why there could be pushback. It says democracy is under attack. By democracy, they generally mean kind of global communism, but still, democracy is under attack globally with serious implications for gender equity. So it's equity. That's the word that everyone else is using in this document. From Turkey to Poland, Iran to Myanmar, Afghanistan to Egypt, and most recently Ukraine, women are on the front lines defending against the simultaneous assault on women's rights and democratic values. Now, this is also interesting because the one thing that's not happening in the Ukraine is women being on the front lines, because there's women all around Scotland where I am from the Ukraine because they've left the Ukraine. And the men weren't allowed to leave because the men had to go and be in the front lines. So again, this isn't being honest. It continues, women's political participation and power threatens authoritarian governments who view women's leadership as tilting a zero-sum game of power politics. It's all about power. Speaking from Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon's government was the most totalitarian I have ever lived under. The idea that women's political leadership ends totalitarianism is fanciful. Whether it makes it worse or whether it's just all part of the same general theme, I'm not so sure. We then get to the question that Brian raised, which is what does equity mean? So there's a very good website called New Discourses. They have a lexicon of social justice warrior terms, so you can actually find out what the words mean. Right? And here they say equity is often conflated with the term equality, which means sameness, and assumes incorrectly that we will all have equal access, treatment, and outcomes. In fact, true equity implies that an individual may need to experience or receive something different, not equal, in order to maintain fairness and access. Right? So equity isn't equality. Equity is being someone in the state deciding to basically harm you or discriminate against you for the greater good. That's what equity means. And the New Discourses continues. So it often is sought under a suite called Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, DEI. Anyone who's involved in any UK major organisation will be familiar with this. And it also says, in early 2020, and rather shockingly, in the Washington State Legislature, an equity task force was assembled that offered the following definition for equity. Equity equals disrupt and dismantle. What do you think of that, Brian?
Well, I think thank you, because of course for me that completely fills in the missing objective, which is you talk peace, reconciliation, togetherness, but actually you're working under the surface in order to break it down. I wonder whether Mark Anderson's got any comments there, as you're mentioning the illustrious Hillary Clinton.
Yes, I do. Something we'll talk about a little later, the United We Stand summit that Joe Biden held September 15th pushes a lot of the same buttons. The normal definition of equity is like an insurance policy. The premium you pay and the benefit you get are equitable or fair, and they make sense. So they're taking an existing concept and twisting it. And how Orwellian can you get that it would actually mean something that you break down? Or the breaking down or the dismantling or the disruption of normal society. And then they accuse others of being disruptors. Again, projection, accusing others what they're guilty of. How many times do we have to see it?
Absolutely.
And just to fill in a little detail there, we go to the actual post in the 2020 Office of Equity Task Force. This is from Washington State. It's titled Disrupt and Dismantle Systems of Institutional Racism and Oppression, Eliminating Racism, and it makes everything about race. And oppression requires revolutionary change. This is from the American state legislature. The Office of Equity's work must be transformative. It must disrupt and dismantle historical systems of institutional racism and oppression throughout every sector and layer of government. Agencies must systematically identify the harm and exclusions built into our current systems and take immediate action to undo these inequities. So there we go. We're going to disrupt and we are going to dismantle, and we are going to do it everywhere. And of course, the great irony, as Mike alluded to earlier on, is all of this has been done in the name of equity for women. Meanwhile, in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon refuses to define what a woman is. She described herself as a feminist to my fingertips, but said to define what a woman is would oversimplify the debate on transgender rights. So equity for women is essential, she says, but she can't tell us what a woman is.
It's incredible, isn't it? To do the UK column news becomes ever more difficult as this terminology gets bandied around. Well, what's the connection between all of that and how many fighters does the RAF have? It wasn't until this morning that I began to understand the true significance. So this was the little question in my head, and it had come up simply because somebody casually mentioned to me it was very difficult to find out actually how big the Royal Air Force was. And if you went to their website, it was rather confusing. So let's just give you a little glimpse. The whole of the Royal Air Force website has been really well designed for probably a 7 or 8 year old boy in the first instance. So there's lots of colourful graphics. You can click on buttons and you'll get information, but none of the information is down to the baseline of how many aircraft they've got and what the real capabilities are. So this was one selection of a page where you can spin a globe. Yes, as you click on the globe, you can spin it. You can then choose a dot and click on it. And when you click on the dot, it will give you some embedded information. So I clicked there in the Middle East and up came exercise Lightning Dawn. Well, it's Cyprus actually. First overseas exercise for the new Lightning aircraft for the RAF and Royal Navy to gain vital experience in maintaining and flying the aircraft in an unfamiliar environment. That was all very good, but I couldn't find out how many there were.
No, it does amuse me though, the word maintaining comes first.
Yes, but don't worry, because if they're having trouble with the aircraft, they're protecting us in space. So there were a lot of dots off the globe, and that confused me initially until I realized that we were actually defending the whole of the universe. So we've got UK Space Command, UK and worldwide, and UK Space Command personnel monitor space 24/7, 365 days a year to protect the UK's interests in space. So that made me feel much happier until I discovered another key page on the RAF website was this: health and well-being. And some of the small print is a little bit difficult to see. So let's have a look at what it says. During the coronavirus lockdown, keeping our physical and mental fitness levels up has never been more important. We've collated a range of tools and resources to support you during this time. Keep checking back for further updates. So according to the RAF, they are still very much fighting in an environment of coronavirus lockdown. I don't know how many other people might say, but I thought we were out of that. But no, they're defending us in space and they're defending against the virus. But let's have a look at this in a bit more detail, because what they do is recommend a great number of organizations for personnel, RAF personnel, to go to in order to keep themselves mentally fit. And this leads me to ask, is there a major mental health problem in the RAF? If there is, then I think we need to be concerned about it. But I decided just to look a little bit deeper, and Headspace I found particularly interesting. It said the Headspace app provides guidelines on mindfulness, meditation, sleep, and more. Serving RAF personnel can get free membership to the Headspace app. Does this make you feel confident about the people defending the universe and the skies, Mike?
No.
No. Well, here's the app, Be Kind to Your Mind, and this is the exact page that comes up when you click from the RAF website. And of course, somebody's trying to sell you something straight away. Who's doing it? Well, here it is, about Headspace. And if we have a look at that in a bit more detail, Headspace was started with one mission: to improve the health and happiness of the world.
It's not much of a success then.
Well, it's interesting stuff, isn't it? So who is all this? Who's doing all this? Well, if you dig in a little bit deeper, you come to Headspace Health. It's democratizing mental health care around the world. It's part of Headspace Health, the world's most accessible, comprehensive provider of mental health and well-being care. And it says that Headspace Health also consists of Headspace for Work and Ginger, who partner with over 2,500 companies and health plans to provide access to meditation, mindfulness, coaching, therapy, psychiatry to their members and employees. Partners include Starbucks, Adobe, Delta Airlines, Viacom, CBS, Cigna, and Kaiser Permanente.
And the RAF?
Well, and the RAF. So we're in good hands in the RAF because they're working with Starbucks on mindfulness. So who is the RAF relying on? Well, these are the prime teachers on the site. You can have a look at their experience. It doesn't seem to me to be world class, but if we bring Sam in, we start to get a clue, because it says Sam is a certified mindfulness facilitator and program leader focused on youth empowerment and education. Now suddenly we've gone from mental health to empowerment and education of youth, and we wonder what the direction for that is going to be. Stay with us. Now, this is quite some organization. It's apparently in 190 countries around the world, 70 million members, 600,000 reviews. So what sort of people would be behind this? Well, we can have a look at their core team. And a couple of these caught my eye. So Michael Strautmanis, Executive Vice President, Civic Engagement, Obama Foundation. Mark, I hope you're paying attention to this because I shall come over to you in a minute. So we've gone from mental health to community and civic engagement, and now we're through to the Obama Foundation. But of course, what other sort of people do you want in healthcare? Well, you need hedge funds. So here we've got Ram Jagannath, Senior Managing Director of Blackstone. And if you do your research on the Blackstone organization, you'll find that it's into some pretty powerful and big money stuff, which is about principally making profit. But here's the Obama Foundation, and our mission is to inspire, empower, and connect people around the world. And it says that it's creating leaders and cohorts of change makers.
Does that make it common purpose for the States?
Well, this is exactly what I'm seeing. I am seeing the fact that we have people buried in society, changing everything, making a new model of the future. But it's very interesting to see that the RAF is connected through to this. Let's have a little look at Obama boasting at his latest building site.
This day has been a long time coming. We are about to break ground on what will be the world's premier institution for developing civic leaders across fields, across disciplines, and yes, across the political spectrum.
The substantial investment in the South Side will help make the neighborhood where we call home a destination for the entire world.
By 2025, change makers from all over the world will come right here to learn about the Obama's journey and engage in celebration in community spaces, marking Jackson Park as an incubator for hope.
But more importantly, this project will be a vital resource for the people who live right here.
We will be able to deepen our commitment to empowering Chicago's residents and allow them to showcase the rich talent and history and culture to visitors from nearby and far away.
The OPC will be a place where folks can find work, where kids can learn and grow and envision bigger lives for themselves.
A campus right here on the South Side where we hope to convene, support, and empower the next generation of leaders. We envision this as a place where residents and visitors from all over the world come together and restore the promise of the People's Park.
To me, this doesn't feel so much like building something new. It feels like we're helping to reveal what has always been here.
And I could not be more excited to officially break ground and get us one step closer to making that vision a reality. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go grab some shovels and break some ground. Ready? Go. Yeah. That's it. Hey! Thank you, everybody.
So I'm going to say to you, Mark, this is interesting because we jump from mental health in the RAF in just a few steps where RAF personnel are being encouraged to take an app, which is actually backed by people with vast amounts of money to make huge profits, but ultimately it's about change, future leaders and change agents. And where do we end up? We end up in Chicago with Obama. This seems to me to take us straight into Saul Alinsky territory.
Oh, it certainly does. You know, that where they're going to build that's only about an hour's drive from where I'm sitting. That you've inspired me. I'm going to have to take a buzz over there and maybe interview a few people and do an article. We'll see about that. But yeah, something I'm talking about today a little bit later, and it doesn't hurt to talk about it now, is that in conjunction with the United We Stand Summit that Biden held September 15th, they've got something called Our Common Purpose, cooked up by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and they're sounding many of the same themes, again, pushing many of the same buttons. This is a very universal thing among the communitarians, the globalists, the liberals, the social justice warriors and whatnot. It's this mind candy, and some of it sounds okay, and maybe there are parts of it that are even agreeable to most people. We might not disagree with every strand of this thing, but again, the problem is always the context. What it strikes me as is a broad effort to homogenize people's thinking, to actually narrow the range of acceptable thought and acceptable speech under the guise of everybody's views are welcome, everybody's welcome to participate. Oh, really? I'd like to see just how just how welcome everyone would be if we brought up ideas in their free speech zone that they claim to inhabit, if we brought up ideas that are inimical or contrary to what they're pushing. Just how open-minded and democratic are they really? And so that's the question to ask, and that's the things to look for. And again, if you dig deeper, if you get below the surface, you'll see the word hate. They're against hate, that all-encompassing boogeyman. They're against extremism. Oh, but they could never be guilty of extremism themselves. They see themselves as anointed, self-anointed, and really beyond reproach. And that's the underlying part that disturbs me and should disturb a lot of people.
Okay, Mark, thank you for that. Well, of course, we have King Charles, who's been saying that he's calling on an army of the international bankers and globalists who control trillions of pounds. So they are the only people who can change the future of the world. Just draw your attention to this little on-screen video from Blackstone. So when we talk about these vast sums of money from the hedge funds, and we find them alongside the likes of change agents, we know we're into a very powerful mix. So encourage people to go and do your own research there with Blackstone. But just fascinating. RAF, is it functioning in a way that we would expect a military organization to function, or is something else taking place? I rather think it's the latter. And Mark, another big group that you stayed on the trail of is, of course, the Bilderberg Group. And we thought they disappeared, but they still seem to be active. What have you got here for us with Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, Malcolm Turnbull is not a household name among those you would call globalists, but on September 15th, happens to be the very night that Biden held his United We Stand summit. No real significance there, just the timing. He spoke to the Economic Club of Southwest Michigan right here in my neck of the woods, and I landed some press creds and went down there. And I actually asked him a question under the rubric of UK column. I mentioned UK column just to put a little something in his craw. But this Malcolm Turnbull, who from 2015 to 2018 was Prime Minister of Australia, is quite the man. Like the headline indicates here, he's worn numerous hats, started out as a lawyer. I couldn't get it all in the headline. He was a journalist, a telecom corporate raider, you might say, creating monopolies, I'm told, by a contact of my own in Australia in the internet world in terms of internet companies. And again, Australian Prime Minister. And now he's with the Kohlberg Kravis KKR firm, which has offices all over the world, Chicago, Houston, etc. And that firm is run by Henry Kravis, who's a longtime Bilderberg fixture, as I mentioned in this article at thetruthhound.com. But his wife, Marie, is not only co-chair of the Bilderberg Steering Committee, but she's president of the American Friends of Bilderberg, which finances and does the arrangements for the American contingent that goes to the annual or almost annual Bilderberg meetings. Due to the COVID disruptions, they don't happen quite as frequent. But Malcolm Turnbull is quite the mover and the shaker. And there's a lot of people out there like that aren't household names, but are strong and persistent change agents. One of the things he said during this presentation at Lake Michigan College in Benton Harbor, Michigan, was that those that disbelieve in climate change are akin to those that disbelieve in gravity, which is quite a statement. And he didn't even make the distinction. As I tried to point out, I could only get one question in. I wanted to ask him more, but he didn't even make the distinction that while many agree maybe that the climate is somehow changing, many see it as solar activity and other largely uncontrollable natural processes that are bringing about whatever variations there are in the climate. And so, in a very oversimplistic, crude sense, he just says if you disbelieve in climate change, therefore you must not believe in gravity either. And then he passes himself off as a conservative. In the Liberal Party, that means conservative in Australia, more or less. He passed himself off as a center right conservative. So I did get a chance to ask him a question. I said, Mark Anderson here for ukcolumn.org. I wanted the audience to hear that so they stop reading just the mainstream press, perhaps. But I said, how do you reconcile being a conservative with the fact, by your own admission, that you're pro gun control, pro gay marriage, and pro abortion without limits? And he gave the most Harry Houdini answer you can possibly imagine. Verbally, he twisted and turned until he got out of the water tank, you might say, until he got the chains off his hands, metaphorically speaking. But it took him about 5 minutes, maybe longer, to explain how a conservative can be so liberal. And so he really had a lot of misrepresentation and absurd statements in his presentation. But he's one to watch. He's very, very active in the pro-vax campaign, the pro-climate change. It has to be due to mankind's activities that we even have global warming. He's very active in all of that, and I think he has more influence maybe than we realize. And there are others like him that they operate just below the surface that are very powerful change agents, which is a powerful theme, or a dominant theme in today's UK column. So Malcolm Turnbull, we haven't heard the last of him, but he certainly is a very wily, worldly change agent that I think we'll see much more from.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, you've now got an excellent segue, I think it's called, into David Scott. And your headline here is "Demand for White Supremacy from FBI Headquarters Vastly Outstrips the Supply of White Supremacy." What is going on?
Well, the United We Stand Summit basically centers on the theme that there's hate and extremism. And although they don't say it explicitly all the time, it really boils down to the idea that the main domestic terrorist threat in the United States is not only white, but white supremacists. But as G. Edward Griffin's Need to Know News site is pointing out, FBI agents have admitted that there's a vast shortage of actual white supremacy. It's largely just an invention, another specter of fear, as if we need more, right? And when they say white supremacy, what they really mean is the basic European, Western Christian model of civilization they see as outmoded, anachronistic, outdated, however you want to describe it. They want a different civilization other than the basic European Christendom, you might say. And so they're trying to, in a very Marxist fashion, agitate, exploit things like equity, as we're talking about, and create these largely false specters of fear and use that as leverage to enact the changes they want, to try and control speech, to try and erect these Obama-related institutions, everything they can do to have societal control in the social sphere, just as they shoot for so much in the information sphere through social media companies, and the financial sphere through BlackRock and Vanguard and companies like that. It's total dominance. What's that old saying? Total awareness. I forget the exact terminology, but full spectrum dominance. There it is.
Okay.
Although they try and soft pedal it and use soft power rather than hard power, nevertheless, I believe the evidence shows that that's what they're after.
Excellent, Mark. Thank you very much for that. So, David, I think that's a good introduction to your next section.
Yes, another little piece on the rabid dog that is British academia. We have here a new book has been published, the Routledge Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness. Now, this is competitively priced at only £190 in hardback, and it's just out this year. It offers a unique decolonial take on the field of critical whiteness studies by rehistoricizing and respatializing the study of bodies and identities in the world system of coloniality. Now, I know you're thinking this is slightly strange language. It seems to look down on normal English because normal English has too few verbs and too few nouns, but there we go. The thing to notice here is of all the people this book is meant for, it's meant for many people, the first one is people in fields of education. So this is going to get into the schools because this is going to get into the training of teachers. The people who edited this are Shona Hunter from Leeds Beckett University and Christy van der Westhuizen from the Nelson Mandela University. And if you're thinking that these people are a wee bit peely-wally, it's a Scots term meaning pale and porcelain-like, you'd be right. But that doesn't mean that they're not very, very upset about whiteness. So we've got some more here on Shona Hunter, just to have a look at her. She's a reader in race education and coloniality at Leeds Beckett University. She says that I'm a big, critical, innovative, multi-dimensional thinker working internationally and across disciplines in this area of power. Again, it's all about power, and doesn't she think well of herself? Now, she has written a book. She's not just edited a book, she's written a book. It's called Power, Politics and Emotions in Possible Governance. Firstly, gentlemen, I'd like your comments on the cover, because that pencil to me looks like a bullet coming out of someone's skull with bits of brain scattering over the page. Is that how you read that?
Yes.
Yeah, and of course we have one very dark eye, and it's a very sinister image, and that was deliberately chosen.
Absolutely. So I haven't read the whole book. I have looked at chapter 1, Governing Subjects, Repression and Equality. And wouldn't you know that right at the start she quotes Tony Blair. And if people can stand it, I think this is from 1997. It's just interesting, right, with a little bit of experience and a bit of water under the bridge, just to look back on this. What Tony said: on May the 1st, the people entrusted me with the task of leading their country into a new century. That was your challenge to me. Proudly, humbly, I accepted it. Today, I issue a challenge to you. Help us make Britain that beacon shining throughout the world. Unite behind our mission to modernise our country. There's a place for all the people in New Britain, capitalised. And there's a role for all the people in its creation. Believe in us as much as we believe in you. Give just as much to our country as we intend to give. Give your all. Make this the giving age. Quote, he's quoting here from Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution. By the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more together than we can alone. On May the 1st, 1997, it wasn't just the Tories who were defeated. Cynicism was defeated. Fear of change was defeated. Fear itself was defeated. Did I not say it would be a battle of hope against fear? On May 1997, fear lost, hope won, the giving age began. Just before we move on, can I have your reaction, gentlemen?
Sorry, David, you can't because I'm too busy being sick in a bucket.
Yep, truly horrific. I will have to repeat my story, which I've now done several times, but I always remember it very fondly, of meeting a neighbour who had spent all his working life on a farm. When I asked him about Tony Blair, the new Prime Minister, he said to me, he's a bad 'un. And I said, what makes you think that? And he said, I've worked with farm animals all my life, and you can always tell a dangerous one by its eyes. So that's my comment.
Okay, well, I thought they thought about, fear itself was defeated. Well, fear made a comeback recently, I would have to say. Now, the whole bit, I was struck though by this whole, by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more together than we can alone, which is from the Labour Party replacement to Clause 4. I thought, well, that rings a bell, so I went looking for it, and here's the new inquiry describing something very similar. Strength through unity. The keystone of the fascist doctrine is its conception of the state, or of its essence, its functions, and its aims. For fascism, the state is absolute, individual and groups relative. Individual and groups are admissible insofar as they come within the state. Instead of directing the game and guiding the material and moral progress of the community, the liberal state restricts its activities to recording results. The fascist state is wide awake and has a will of its own. And he continued, and that makes it moral. Or was it ethical? I think it was ethical is the word they used. This is Benito Mussolini speaking in 1932. And I say just in the passing, New Labour was fascism. The whole thing about the third way, we're not capitalism, we're not communism, we're a third way. Yes, the third way always was fascism, and that's what they were, and it's very plain. Getting back, though, to Shona, she's got a website, and it's called White Spaces. It's all about race, and it's a collaboration against whiteness. White Spaces collaborates on a range of projects with organisations, networks, groups and individuals who are working to shift understanding and practices of global colonial power from within a relational ethos. It goes on with many words. So how are they doing this? Well, they are refusing the colonial black-white binary. This requires collaborative working across binary racialized positionalities. The English is horrendous. To disrupt oversimplified understandings of people's positioning within racism and anti-racism as either good or bad, vulnerable or empowered, resistor or dominator. Working across these binaries is a way of refusing these simplifications in practice by privileging complex lived interpretations and practices of coalition in anti-racist resistance. This sounds like word soup, but actually when you analyse it, we don't have time to go into it in detail just now, but there's a lot of grabbing of power and there's a lot of removing of your right to say, no, I don't agree with this.
David, sorry, David, I just want to interrupt there for a second, because that language, if I just put that back on screen for a second, that language, people's positioning within racism and anti-racism as either good or bad, vulnerable or empowered, a resistor or a dominator, and they're talking about binaries. This is exactly the language that Nick Carter was using whenever he was chief of the defense staff, talking about war and peace no longer being a binary thing. It's a spectrum thing. This is hybrid warfare we're talking about here.
That's a very good point, Mike. It's hybrid warfare on our minds, our children, and our institutions. She also refuses the colonial space-time binary. This requires different ways of thinking about time and space as interconnected and intersectional, with what is understood to be past is also understood to be present, and what is seen to be over there is also seen to be in here. Now, on one level, that's very funny, but if you thought that space and time actually understood them, Mike, that's because you're a racist. And they also refuse the mind-body binary, and they also refuse the individual and institution binary. Right? So this one's quite sneaky. It requires a different way of thinking about the relationship between the systemic politics of whiteness and individual practices of power. The aim is to challenge the institutionalization of blame for racism onto individuals and groups of people racialized as white as a systemic strategy of whiteness which avoids responsibility for racist reproduction. So if you point to someone and say, he's being racist, I don't approve of that, that's racist, Mike. There's no escaping whiteness. Back very quickly, new discourses cover some of the word plays. You see, one of the difficulties here is these people use your vocabulary, but they don't use your dictionary, right? So the words have different meanings. So you've got to actually check what they mean. Critical race theory, right? Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything like critical thinking. It means destroying the entire society so that something else can emerge in its place. And on whiteness studies, it's all about, I've had enough. You can read that one for yourself. There's more changing of meanings and deception, essentially to hide a religion, right? This is a strange Marxist-based religion, and it has, like religions, it encompasses the whole of thought. It's an entire worldview, an entire way of looking at things, and it's being put forward principally via the education establishment. Hence, it's coming into our schools and it will be taught to our children. It's there to divide, it's there to encourage them to view themselves as victims or as perpetrators. It's to divide our people, and it is wholly negative. And it is, and they actually describe this themselves, virus-like, in that once they take over one institution, people leave that institution and they carry the virus of these ideas with them into other institutions. And it's not just ideas, it's all about practice, praxis, as they say. It's all about actually putting into effect policies, teaching methods to change society. And it's lifelong, and it is a very dangerous ideology, and it gives a big clue as to why we are seeing so many institutions in this country behaving in ways which are the very opposite of what's in the best interest of either themselves or certainly of the people they are meant to serve.
Common purpose again.
Well, it is a common purpose agenda, essentially, but if viewers, listeners are not aware of Saul Alinsky and his book, Rules for Radicals, have a look at that, because that was the textbook for getting in and destroying society.
Now, let's move back to the UK again and to Leicester. And many people will have be aware of this, but Leicester media was pushing this out yesterday. Forest Road is completely closed due to the ongoing unrest in Leicester tonight. So 15 people were arrested. Leicestershire Police said officers became aware of groups of young men gathering on Sunday afternoon in the North Evington area of the city. Officers spoke to them and took steps, including putting in place a temporary police cordon to minimise harm and disturbance to communities. The police also said that the 15 remained in custody, and they said that large crowds had formed when groups of young men gathered for unplanned protest. Well, the best sort of coverage of the background for this that I'd seen was from The Spectator. Why is violence breaking out in Leicester? So let's just bring this on screen. They're saying the trouble began at the end of August when, on a cricket field thousands of miles away in Dubai, England defeated Pakistan by 5 wickets in an Asia Cup match. After the game, large crowds of young men draped in Indian flags began celebrating on Melton Road in Leicester. The celebration soon turned nasty, with fights breaking out and one man arrested on suspicion of assaulting an emergency worker. Videos of celebration show Indian supporters appearing to chant a partition era slogan, which can be roughly translated as "Death to Pakistan." Now, both sides of this, the Muslim and Hindu communities are blaming each other for it, but it seems to be that it was the case that the initial chanting and the initial incitement began with the Hindu community. So this has been going on more or less since that cricket match on the 28th of August. In a statement, the leaders of the Hindu and Jain temples said that we condemn the insensitive and utterly disgraceful acts on the streets of Belgrave and North Evington. Leaders of the Hindu community are not going to tolerate such acts of aggression that undermines the relationships and unity within the city of Leicester. And on the Muslim side, they said, well, basically the police weren't protecting us, so we're going to take matters into our own hands. So, David, we're running out of time, but very briefly, interested to get your thoughts on this. But I'm hearing that this is happening in other towns as well.
It's extremely concerning. I mean, we've got here essentially something verging on warfare between two sides, and you've got a police force talking about our communities. They're not talking about our community anymore. They're not even pretending that they have a community. They've got multiple communities at one another's throats, it would seem, at least for the present. This is multiculturalism. This was, of course, the plan.
Yes. Okay, let's move over to the question of journalism. And I saw this article in the Mail, which raised some questions for me. So this is from Alex Brummer, and his headline is "Investigative Journalism is a Public Good. It is often an unequal fight when big corporations are involved, but don't give up. And what he's saying here is the latest Economist parodies UK titles for Pravda journalism in coverage of Queen Elizabeth II's death. A fuller reading reveals acres of material ranging from royal complicity and colonialism to criticism of that royal miscreant, the Duke of York. Well, perhaps it has been there, but as a proportion of the overall content, it's been a very small proportion of the overall content. And so it's hardly surprising that, although I'm not going to defend The Economist in any way, but it's hardly surprising that there's been some criticism of the coverage. Anyway, he goes on to say, investigative and campaigning journalism is a public good. And I absolutely agree with that sentiment. It is a public good, but we're not saying it. Anyway, he goes on in his article to see the powerful role which financial journalism can and does play in cleaning up business is central to the documentary Scandal, Bringing Down Wirecard, released by Netflix. The film tells the story of how assiduous Financial Times journalism, backed by a determined editor, Lionel Barber, brought the fraudsters at fintech pioneer Wirecard crashing down and embarrassed German authorities. It also demonstrated how easily serious investors, auditors, and markets can be bamboozled if they don't want to believe something. And I'm going to say that there is a good investigative journalism out there still, but it's mainly focused on this type of thing, on financial crime, corporate crime, and so on. Where we're not getting any real investigative journalism in the mainstream press is with respect to geopolitics or the activities of governments and so on. And we've covered why that is in the past. But part of the problem here, of course, is that we now have an entire infrastructure built up to make sure that the narrative in the mainstream press and on the internet and so on is kept in line. And so I just want to mention this because European fact-checking organizations have now approved a code of professional standards to combat misinformation. And this is from this organization, the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. So let's have a look at the report itself. This is the European Code of Standards for Independent Fact-Checking Organizations. And here's one of the things it says. The European Code of Standards for Independent Fact-Checking Organizations is a set of criteria designed to ensure that organizations fact-checking mis and disinformation adhere to the highest standards of methodology, ethics, and transparency in order to best serve the public interest. That should make you feel absolutely great, Brian.
Yeah, they'll be independent, Mike.
Absolutely. So the European Code of Standards and the EFCSN are open to organizations dedicated to fact-checking, defined as the use of evidence-based methods to verify the accuracy of claims made in the public space. Organizations must have a substantial and demonstrable focus on a country that is a member of the Council of Europe, Kosovo, and Belarus to apply. So keep that in mind for a second when we look at who some of the members are: Council of Europe, Kosovo, and Belarus. But nonetheless, evidence-based method. Well, what is the evidence that we see in most fact-checking reports? The evidence is the regurgitation of official government statements. That's the evidence that we actually see in fact-checking reports. And there's nothing in this standard from this organization which rules that out. It goes on to say, provide evidence. So they're required to provide evidence for every pertinent factual statement made in an investigation, relying on primary sources. Well, when the primary sources that they rely on are the government, then we don't actually get any proper fact-checking at all. Provide at least two, though preferably more, sources to verify the central claim of investigation, except in cases where there's only a single relevant source, like the government, for example. Again, none of this rules out relying on the government as the source of information as a primary source. So let's just have a look and see who the key players are in this. Here's the working committee members. And who do you see on there, Brian, that absolutely jumps out at you straight away?
Well, certainly a little organization called Full Fact.
Yes,
pops up pretty quickly.
So there are two organizations from the United Kingdom on this, even though it's an EU thing. So Full Fact is one, and Logically is the other. And when we look at the Full Fact website, what do we find? Well, we find them campaigning for the government to ensure that the online safety bill protects citizens from harm. So there we go. Investigative journalism should be a thing. I'm not questioning that at all. I'm absolutely questioning whether it exists anymore in this country in any real sense, because the mainstream media outlets are completely owned and controlled by the government and the fact-checking organizations.
What can I say? it's pretty obvious what's happening here.
Yes.
And we're going to do our best to get the information out there, because otherwise, who reports what's actually happening?
Indeed. Okay, just a quick reminder, if you like what the UK column does and you'd like to support us, then please head to community.ukcolumn.org, and there are options for you to join us there. You'd be very welcome. Or pick something up at the UK column shop, but please do share material on the various platforms. Where does that take us?
Well, of course, when you asked the question, I was checking my facts, Mike, because we want to just pop up on screen that this is Mark Anderson's latest article, is now on the front page of the UK column. Apologies there, Mark, because I realised that I chopped the header off slightly. So just very quickly, tell us what this article's about.
Well, it's a long and broad one to wind up my Red Pill coverage from mid-July in Indianapolis, Indiana, the Red Pill Expo. It mentions also that they're having another one, I think they have twice a year, in Utah in mid-November. And I hope to possibly attend that, maybe even participate as a speaker. I don't know yet. It's too soon to know. I will mention that at the end of that article, the Freedom Force International and Red Pill University that puts on the Red Pill Expo says this about unity and all that. And this provides a counterpoint to all this doublespeak that we're hearing. To achieve all we want to do requires diversity without conflict, power without coercion, and unity without conformity. See, so there's nothing really wrong with unity in and of itself or diversity, but these are misconstrued and completely maligned and completely overturned by the people and forces we've been discussing today. So the people that put on Red Pill have a much more logical and rational view of diversity, unity, and things like that. And I think that's an important takeaway from that article. That's toward the end of the article, which covers all the other speakers that weren't covered in the first two installments from that expo. So I appreciate you showing that. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, just wanted to mention this, Brian. And that was that last week, if you looked at the royal family's Twitter feed, there was, if we're talking about whether there are political statements being made by the royal family or not, this was the only comment with respect to the book of condolence, the various books of condolence that are out there from various countries. They decided to retweet this one. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office have been tweeting and retweeting a whole range of different world leaders and different countries, but the royal family chose Zelensky as the one, and that seemed like a political statement to me.
Well, it's absolutely a political statement, and of course the royal family are going to continue to push out a political statement with regards to Ukraine. As a very quick update, and as always, we're going to thank other people who are doing a lot of very good research work to bring out the facts to a worldwide audience. So today I've chosen the Military Summary channel, and this is a couple of screenshots. Encourage you to go to YouTube and actually watch and listen the full video. But if we just have a look at a couple of places on the front, this is Mykolaiv front. This is where the Ukrainians were going to have this huge attack, offensive towards Kherson. In the event, the thing simply did not get going, and the offensive was crushed with very heavy losses. So this part of the front, at least, nothing much happening in the lowest southwestern area. But if we move up to the circled area, this is where Russian forces crossed the Ingulets River and made an incursion into Russian-held territory. The Russians blew a dam at Krivoy Rog, flooded the river, caused quite a lot of disturbance to the Ukrainian supply lines and the reinforcement routes. And it would appear at the moment that the Russians are simply hammering the Ukrainian forces that are now on the Russian side of the river with artillery, and the reports of casualties are truly horrific. I'll come on to those a bit later. But if we move along the front, Zaporozhye, we've got some exchanges of artillery, very heavy strikes by the Russian, including Russian Air Force, some counter battery fire into Russian-held territory. but generally the bulk of the fighting is round into the Donbass area, and in particular where the Russians are fighting very hard with their Ukrainian allies to take territory west of Donetsk. And this is to try and take pressure off the city because the Ukrainians are once again specifically shelling civilian areas of Donetsk. And the Russian response is extremely hard. So it does appear that over the last week in particular, the Russian stance has firmed up, and they are bringing more and more weapon systems to bear, with the result the Ukrainian casualties increase. So if we have a look at this overview screenshot, you can see the little orange flashes, which are where there's either been extremely heavy strikes or there is quite a lot of fighting on the front. And I'll include this one because a report here from one blogger showing damage to the administration center in the Kherson region. And of course, these are all Ukraine HIMARS attacks. Well, they're not, because this is courtesy of the US. And this is something which I find despicable, that we have the US, UK, and EU sitting in the background, supplying the weapons, helping the targeting, and those weapons are clearly being used to target civilian infrastructure, which is largely at peace. So overall, what can we say? Many of the reports online are that in the last 2 months, Ukrainian casualties as high as 52,000 men killed and wounded. And we've also got the other bizarre story that America is now so short of military production capacity that they're offering Ukraine 12,155 millimeter shells per month, when the expenditure of that sort of ammunition is probably nearer the 3,000-4,000 shells a day. So we're now witnessing that America's incapable of producing ammunition. But the real tragedy is the deaths, because the Ukrainians are continuing relatively small-scale attacks along the front, and each time they do it, they are losing 6, 7, 8, or 9 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and we are seeing men killed in increasing numbers. So it's not uncommon now in a day for 500 Ukrainians to be killed, and this is all courtesy of the Western weapon systems being pushed into the country.
Does that take us back to Mark?
It does, because I've mentioned obviously the US involvement, and I think President Biden here, United We Stand, was a bit too much to take, really.
Yeah, more mental warfare. As we've always said, war is always psychological and informational. Fighting and violence and weapons and all that is a secondary thing. And this United We Stand, when we have a porous southern border along the Texas line and Arizona, New Mexico, and California, this United We Stand thing is particularly diversionary in that sense. We've got some real problems that affect everybody. The fentanyl drugs coming in, the criminal gangs, MS-13, and drug cartel scouts who enlist younger people to do some of their scouting and miscellaneous work, as I've mentioned on UK Column before. We've got real problems, but Biden says that the main problem is hate, and specifically white hate, aka white supremacy, and that's what the United We Stand Summit, September 15, which I mentioned earlier today, was about. And get this, you'd almost want to think that it had some merit, and yet those backing it include the Democracy Fund, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Kettering MacArthur Foundations, Open Society, George Soros, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, that originated in Michigan, I believe, here, and so on and so forth. And 140 mayors have signed a new mayor's compact to combat hate and extremism, hate-fueled violence, things like that. And so, once again, a particular segment of society, white, everyday people, are being looked at as that segment that is most likely to commit some sort of hateful crime, most likely involving some kind of violence. And they've got something called the New Pluralists. Get that, a cross ideological group of philanthropists, social change makers, local leaders, more along the lines of what we've been discussing during the entire broadcast today. But just to jump ahead a little bit, you guys talked about the initiatives there, and YouTube is expanding its policies to combat violent extremism. This was also at the United We Stand Summit. It was a very long summit, and there's just reams of literature that I could have printed out. I printed out only a small part that I could make sense of. There's something called Twitch, which will accelerate its ongoing commitment to deterring hate in live streaming. Microsoft is expanding its application of violence detection and prevention via artificial intelligence, machine learning tools, using gaming even to build empathy. There's another buzzword in young people. And Meta is forging a new research partnership with the Middlebury Institute, which might be Vermont, of International Studies Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism. And yet we heard earlier that some FBI agents say there's a shortage of what actual white extremism or white supremacy, even though there's a high demand among the Biden-led Justice Department and in so many private and public sectors.
Yeah,
there'll
the
be
problem
more
is, Mark,
on
sorry
this.
sorry to interrupt. The problem there, Mark, is that, of course, the language of hate and extremism and so on and white supremacy is being used to cover what's really going on, which is this notion of information terrorism. And we've started seeing this term being used openly now, this term of information terrorism. This is what David Cameron was talking about in 2014 when he was talking about censoring the internet because of the violent extremism that is on the internet, but they never dealt with and they never wanted to deal with Islamic violent extremism that was coming out of ISIS or Al Qaeda or any of these organizations in the Middle East. What they're really aiming to do here is to deal with the information terrorism, which is counter the official narrative.
Oh, absolutely. And ISIS outfits like that, of course, were largely intelligence creations, or at least intelligence infiltrated creations. At any rate, oh, that's absolutely it. They're sandbagging and doing everything they can, because we can take heart a little bit. They wouldn't be this intent on controlling information unless they were afraid of losing the narrative, and they wouldn't be so intent on manipulating public opinion if they weren't afraid of informed public opinion.
Yes.
See, so there's some heart that we can take in this. They are really, really dropping the info bombs and whatnot, metaphorically speaking, because they're afraid of losing that narrative. The mainstream media, the mass media cartel, as I call it, is losing readers and viewers and subscriptions every day, while those like us, however slowly or incrementally, are growing, and sometimes not so slowly. And information is everything. We know that. Once it reaches a certain threshold and they lose grip of that narrative, it could be all over, and they're well aware of that, and that would explain at least some of their antagonism.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Mark. And then David, just to finish off here, we've got a tweet